Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is something that is going to be pertinent to everybody now that we are in the racing season, and it's centered around this topic of how do you go out and find and solicit advice from people who have done the same races as you and who might be doing similar training to you. As coaches, we have to manage this all of the time because most of us coaches, we do a lot of the same races that our athletes end up doing. And so we wanted to use a little bit of that experience as a lens to look through to impart on how we actually translate our own training and racing experience to our athletes and where we might actually not translate that racing experience. So on the podcast today, I have two of our crack coaches. Welcome to the podcast, repeat offender Ryan Anderson, who is currently training for the notorious Hard Rock 100, and new to the podcast, but certainly not new to coaching, is one of our stellar coaches, and Tisdell, who is just off of a fantastic finish at the Cocodona 250, and we run through it all. We are experienced athletes as well as experienced coaches in the sport, and how do we take our own personal experiences and either translate those to our athletes or choose to not translate to those athletes. And what I hope that you can glean throughout the course of this conversation is how you can provide a little bit of a filter for yourself as you are soliciting information, counsel, and things that can help you prepare for the races that you are preparing for this summer. All right, with that out of the way, I am getting right out of the way. Here is my podcast with coaches Ryan Anderson and Ann Tisdell, all about how we translate our own training and racing over to our athletes and where that might actually not be as applicable. And Ryan, welcome to the podcast. And have you been on before? I am searching my memory. I don't think so, right?
No, first time.
Okay, first time. Ryan's a multi-time offender, so he's kind of used to the gig. So we're going to talk today about how to translate our own like personal experiences into what's functional for athletes. And then what I hope that the audience can kind of take away from this is now that we're kind of in the racing season and everybody's like searching for advice in the far corners of the internet, whether that be from their friends or the Reddit forums or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. Hopefully some of these lessons that we actually use as coaches can be translated to the audience while they're trying to like navigate the same thing of how to actually glean information from people who have trained or who are training for the same events, and then what information to take, what information to potentially throw away, and what kind of like caveats to put out on it. And the reason I wanted to do this with you two, because you guys are training for and have trained for a kind of a prolific series of events, and I could probably apply that same description to myself. We've got a wealth of event experience, personal event experience, kind of in our group today that we're going to be discussing this with. But we also have to, in a very pragmatic way, tailor that what we learned from those races individually into a professional setting where we are professionally advising athletes on some of the events that we have actually trained for. And that's a different level of scrutiny than a friend or a colleague or a training partner has to have when they're just saying, oh, well, when I did the Leadville Trail 100, this is what happened. That's fine. Nobody's like trying to impart wisdom with like ill intent or anything like that. But there's a different kind of burden of proof, so to speak, with people who are professional coaches when they take what they have done personally and then try to glean some information from that onto their athletes. So with that as a bit of a backdrop, I want to set the table a little bit more. And we never do this as coaches. It's going to be kind of weird because we try to downplay our own like personal experiences, but this is a podcast where I think we have to actually kind of like bring it to the forefront. So Ann, we're going to start with you. Can you try to, I just mentioned that you have kind of a prolific list of events that you have done. Can you kind of bring to the forefront and try to encapsulate that in a couple of minutes, all the events that you have personally trained for and completed or tried or whatever.
Yeah. All right. So there's been all like the little stuff, but let's focus on the more exciting ones. So last week, Pocadona 250. I'll just start with that one because it was the most recent. That's my third 200 miler. So back in 2019, my husband and I did Tahoe 200 together. And then last year did Moab 240 solo, Cocodona just last week solo. In addition to that, I'd say one of my favorite races in the whole world is Ouray 100. So I've been to the race 3 times, finished it twice, dropped with my husband once when he had some medical issues. So we got the 200s, we've got Ouray. What else is there? Been out to canyons. What have I done? Total other end of the spectrum, Florida Keys 100, the polar opposite of everything that I just described.
Yeah.
Those are the big ones. I think those kind of fall towards the top of the list for me.
Well, first off, congratulations on Cocodona. We were talking off air that you look great out there all day. It was really fun to personally see you out there, although in a slightly limited capacity. I want to kind of bring up the breadth here just to paint this for the listeners again. You've got mountainous stuff, you've got flat stuff, hot stuff, cold stuff, things where you've done really well and podiumed and raced well, and you can be super proud of those performances. And then also times where you've dropped, like you've kind of got the whole rainbow of like performance context to go into this. Is there anything else you want to add to that, just in terms of your sheer race resume that like sticks out and jumps off of the paper for you?
I'll just add maybe the 2 things that are coming up, one of which I'm particularly excited about. So there's Ouray again this year, just continuing the trend of doing a hard race and thinking, wow, I'm never going to do this again. And then finding myself signing up for it again. And then next year, big one, Arizona Monster 300. So new race. I'm excited to be one of the first to get to try it. And if 250 was good, then 300 should surely be better, right? That's what I'm thinking.
Oh my God. I had an inquiry from my website. Somebody asking about coaching for that specific race. So it's taken the world by storm.
Oh, it's exciting. I can't wait. It's just like one more day, right? One more day.
Just one
How
more
bad
day.
could it be?
Just one more day. Yeah, just one more day on top of it all. All right. All right, Ryan, you're up. You've got Hard Rock coming up this year. You're currently training for that. But why don't you kind of like go back a little bit before you go to the present and just kind of give the listeners a sense of your resume, which you can kind of like bring to the table here.
Yeah, I started my Hard Rock qualifier journey in 2017 with Bighorn as my first 100 miler, and then did Grindstone in Virginia 2 years later, and then did the Bear last year. And I've also did the Pinhoti 100 down in Alabama, down here in the South twice. And then I have had some experience in the San Juans, doing San Juan Solstice 50 miler twice. And then just a smattering of local ultras here in the Southeast that I like to revisit year after year.
And currently, I already mentioned this, you're training for the Hard Rock 100. It's always an apex event for anybody who gets in it, especially the first year. I think it's also worth pointing out where you live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I live in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Sea level.
We're at 1,000 feet. Hey, we got 1,000. And in town, there are not a lot of hills or long climbs to speak of, but I am fortunate to live in between Frozen Head and the Smokies. So I can go get the mountainous terrain, the 3,000 to 4,000 foot climbs and descents. It just takes a little bit of driving. It's cramming, for lack of a better word, on the weekend to get in that vert specific terrain, specific type of terrain.
Perfect.
But yes, coming from sea level presents a challenge, but frankly, that's how it is for most people doing that race.
Yeah. I did not know that you did the San Juan Solstice twice. That's new. That's new information to me. Very hard race. I'm doing that in 4 weeks, 5 weeks. It's coming up pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
I should know that. That might give you an indication of how ill prepared I am at the present time. Okay, so I'll go next. I'll play ball. I have a similar breadth of breadth of races that I've done, both short and long, starting with, I guess, in my backyard, the Pikes Peak Marathon. I wasn't even thinking about mentioning this, but both the Pikes Peak Marathon and the Pikes Peak Ascent that I had done for years before I started getting into ultra running. And then you transition over to the the ultra side of things. And I've done anything from the Badwater 135, obviously hot, flat in the desert, to the Hard Rock 100, to Tour de Géant, to Cocodona, to Western States. I have one finish at Western States, and that'll probably be my only finish at that prolific race. I'm a multi-time finisher at the Leadville Trail 100. I'm trying to get 10 eventually. My schedule will kind of allow me to. But a lot of my racing has kind of been, not, I was going to use the word stuck, but it's been kind of like limited to the Rocky Mountains. I would say I don't have that much experience out on the East Coast. I have a little bit out on the West Coast and then in the Pacific Northwest, but that I would say would be very, very limited. My home base is Colorado Springs, Colorado. Altitude. We've got great trails here. They're very unheralded, but I think a world-class trail system, which I think lends itself really well to training for both mountainous events and flat events. So I've been able to leverage that kind of home training environment a tremendous amount, irrespective of what I was actually personally training for. Let's see, is there anything else I should mention? I can open it up to you guys. You guys can ask a question. What else should I mention on my own?
In the self-supported realm, you gave Nolan's 14 a
Oh
couple
yeah, that's
tries, right?
Yeah, I have. Well, okay, so that actually prompts my memory a little bit. I do have, oh my God, 3 now failed attempts at the Nolan's 14, ranging from the Nolan's 12, which is the furthest I've gotten, to the Nolan's 2. So big range of failures right there. One of them, the one in the middle, was actually an attempt with one of our own coaching staff, John Fitzgerald. But that actually prompts me to think that I've also been really bad in races. I've dropped out of my fair share of hundreds. The Wasatch 100, I've dropped out of, as well as a Javelina. I dropped out of 1 year, so much flatter, kind of easier type of race. I dropped out of Hard Rock 1 year. So I've kind of run the gamut of where I've been pretty good or really good in some races, and I've been really bad and DNF'd for a whole variety of reasons, including DNFs that I probably shouldn't have taken. I probably should have just sucked it up and continued forward in hindsight. So definitely the whole range of things, as they say. Okay, so with that as a little bit of a backdrop, I think the first thing that I want to discuss more globally, and we're going to try to leave the specifics out for right now, but just globally, is what you take from the training process specifically. We're going to leave racing as a separate deal, but the training process specifically that you then can impart to your athletes. So we just mentioned one of the things that I want to bring to the forefront is not only do we have what I would call a robust amount of experience of ourselves racing in these events, as the results would be an indicator of, we've also been successful and unsuccessful in the training side of things, right? Because training is the litmus test for the race itself. It's not always the perfect corollary, but it's a pretty darn good one, where if the race results are good, you can probably count on the training actually being good in concert with that. And the opposite would also be true, where the race results are typically poor. Usually you miss something in training. And so we've made all those mistakes personally. Let's go over that piece of it first. And I think that one thing I kind of want to clear up, that before each of us discuss this training component of it, is, where do you get your training from? Do you do it yourself? Do you have a coach manage your training? And then go into what pieces of that training process can you actually impart on your athletes. We're going to go round robin style, and we're going to start with you again. So you get first crack at this question. So how do you organize your training first as a coach? And then what pieces of that training process can you, or do you then translate down into your athletes when they're going through something that might be relatable?
Sure. So I'd say the way that I have historically treated my training is basically what I do for my athletes. I use Training Peaks. I use like the same methodology, the same long range plan, break it down into a week by week plan. That's how I've historically done things for myself. I haven't had a coach personally. Would I love to have one? Yeah, that's actually a goal of mine, maybe in the next year or so. But it's always been self-managed to date. Now I'll say this. So one of the biggest lessons that I've learned about my own training is that it doesn't have to be perfect. It should have an appropriate amount of volume. It should be consistent. It should include race specific training as much as possible, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, especially in times of your life where things are just really busy or stressful and you've got other stuff going on. You can get creative. And that is also something that I do with my athletes too. So the last 8 months in particular, I'd say life stress has been much higher than usual. And this is something I see in a ton of my athletes too, whether it's work or kids or illness or whatever. And I've realized that during those times, the level of perfection can scale down as long as you're just getting the basics done. So that's where I say, all right, we need to do this stuff this week. And as long as you get this stuff done, I kind of don't care how it happens. So here's the perfect plan. Let's mess it up as much as we need, but let's try to at least achieve these like key milestones. And that's something that I'd say 90% of my athletes are going through some sort of like busy period or stressful period at some point in our relationship together. And that's something I can definitely translate to them. This idea of you've got to do the minimum and it should really be consistent and you should really do some race specific stuff, but does it have to be absolutely perfect? No, it doesn't. So that's my starting point. Would I ever take my own exact training plan and give it to an athlete, even if it was for the exact same race and the exact same timeline and they live down the street from me? No, because we are two totally different people with different jobs and different lives and different backgrounds. So I will never, like in terms of things I don't translate, it's the training plan. It's the like number of intervals I'm doing. It's the amount of volume that I'm doing each week. It's the structure of those things. But what I can translate is like the life experience and the race experience and that sort of thing. I'll pause there. Does that make sense so far?
So here's what I'm taking from that. It's the general themes, not the specific,
Yeah.
not the specificity side of things. So the general themes of, I know what it's like to be busy. I know what it's like to have imperfections in your training program. I know what it's like to have life stress. And here it's almost like an empathetic translation, right? So here's how we're going to take all of these, moles and flaws and hairs and wrinkles in the life and training process and make something really, really productive about it. And it's not, and I think deliberately not, I'm glad you brought that piece of it out. I did this super amazing specific workout for the Cocodona 250. And then so therefore this athlete is going to get either that exact same thing or some sort of like, close close variation of that. That when you, as you were speaking, that's what kind of came to the forefront of my mind is that these general experiences are relatable, but the specific ones are not.
I totally agree with that. I would say the only things that are more specific that I do translate to my athletes are they're probably just the nuances of like this race experience. So for example, wow, I realized at high altitude, it gets really hard to eat these certain things. Yes, I'm going to share that with you. And then let's talk about your nutrition plan and let's talk about what you're practicing and what you're planning to use. Or on the other end of the spectrum, Florida Keys, it's really freaking hot. And it gets really hard to eat these kinds of things. So let's talk about that and how it applies to you too, because there are certain things like that that are probably going to apply to every single athlete that's in that race. But when it comes to myself and my mind and my body and exactly what it did every day to get ready for this thing, it's probably going to look pretty different from what this athlete and this athlete and that athlete and their mind and their body and their history are going to do to get ready for that thing.
Okay. I'm going to put a pin in that specific piece because I'm going to bring up another question to both you and Ryan, because I think that there's going to be a theme that emerges from this that we can discuss as coaches. But Ryan, let's kind of like move on to you. How would you how would you describe this component of, first off, how do you organize your own training, right? Being a coach, being a professional in the space. And then what pieces of that process are you then translating into your athletes that are training for similar events?
So I'm coached by fellow CTS coach Darcy Murphy.
Shout out to
Um,
Darcy. She's one of the best.
shout out Darcy. She is one of the best. And it's a good personality match. She knows when to push back and when to be empathetic on the theme of Anne and being time crunched. We are all time crunched, and there can be a moment for all of us when we make excuses and let those spiral rather than sucking it up and getting it done, whether it's waking up early and being more stern with ourselves. I think that's a general theme of learning this balance of when to be empathetic and when to go drill sergeant on yourself. Um, and then broadly speaking, identify the specifics as best you can for your event. And if you're limited by geography, extreme weather, we have to put in these non-negotiables within the long range plan of, okay, racing at altitude, have to get out there early. That's pretty simple. And formulating a plan around that and doing it on the front end. So I know, hey, we are addressing these things and I know I'm preparing for them. So I'm not going to freak out and get anxious and try to cram for the test and get stuck in the weeds with little things that I'm nervous about at the last minute. I've identified those significant demands, what I'm least confident about, and I'm addressing those. So as the race gets closer, I'm feeling more and more confident rather than more and more anxious.
Okay, I want to bring up one like specific point that Anne really brought to my attention just a second ago. And this is what happens when you're working with athletes that are doing the exact same race as you have done. And I'm going to back this up a little bit and bring in another one of our CTS colleagues, Dominic. One of the questions, or one of the features, I guess, that he gets requested of the coaches when he's navigating how to pair up an incoming athlete with a new coach is the athletes very often request that they have a coach that has done the race that they are training for. And if they've got a few races on the calendar, hey, I want, a coach that's done this, and this. And we've always had a push pull with that request. The push is that, yeah, the coach has experience doing that themselves. And so there's a little bit of it's not an appeal to authority, but maybe it's an appeal to having actually done the race. It gives them some street cred, right? In doing it. I've done Tour de Géant. Somebody comes in, they, want a coach that's done Tour de Géant because they feel that that's some sort of like prerequisite to coach for the event. So on the match piece of it, it's nice to have, right? Because it gives the athlete an immediate sense of security that they know the coach has been through what they're about to go through, right? And that's meaningful in the coach athlete relationship. I'm kind of like I'm not denying that the buy-in is actually meaningful in the entirety of the process. But it's certainly not a necessity. So I want to answer this. I want to go over this really specific question because I know we've all had it. When you've been working with an athlete that is training for a race that you have done, and they ask you what you did for it, but your prescription to that athlete is different. So, I've done the Hard Rock 100, and I have just had this happen a few weeks ago. That's why my brain was kind of prompted to this as well. My athlete asked me, "Hey, what did you do 6 weeks beforehand?" Whatever the time frame was, 8 weeks beforehand. And I said, well, you can see it in Strava. I did this, and this, but you were doing that, and that because of this context, right? There's this discrepancy between this is what I did and this is what you did. And even though I had a really successful blueprint on this, you're doing this because of whatever reasons that we're just going to kind of go through now. So Ryan, I'm going to kind of like ping it back to you. What have you done in that situation where you're you're coaching an athlete for a race that you have trained for, and they've asked this question, hey, what did you do? And there's a discrepancy between what you're prescribing and what you have actually done, or what Darcy has kind of prescribed for yourself.
I would say maybe when someone lives close to the race, and I also live close to that race, and I've either did the smaller event leading up to it. But okay,
Mm,
so take Pinhoti 100 for example. There's a 50 miler on the course in September, and there's a 50K on the course in February. And I've did that 50K in February. And maybe I haven't encouraged an athlete like, hey, this is a non-negotiable. Go do this race to get an idea of the course. And like, well, why wouldn't I do that if I have the opportunity to do it? It's like, well, maybe that 50K in February for a race that is how many months is that? 9 months out, doesn't fit within your training right now. So we're not going to force that. That could be an example. Or oh, okay, it's this race in the beginning of October. There's a chance it could be hot, but it could be cold. I did heat training to be safe, but I'm not advocating for you to do that because of XYZ. Well, why not? And then, of course, you have to have a reason for it. Those are two immediate examples I can think of.
I've got one, and Ann, I'm going to let you ruminate in your head to kind of come up with an example. So I have one finish at the Badwater 135. And the most common question that I get out of all of my coaching experience in any format by a long shot is, what should my longest long run be before race X? That is like universally the most asked question that I get year round, and it's been that way for over a decade. And so, true to form, whenever I have athletes that that ask me what my that I'm training for the Badwater 135, and they ask me what my longest long run before that race was, and it is exactly 63 miles. And I can remember the exact route that I did from my home in Colorado Springs to tally up 63 miles. Why was it 63 miles? It was just the way this loop worked out, and it was about kind of like what I wanted to do and things like that. The longest long run that I give any other athlete, it's improbable that it would be exactly 63 miles. And the way that I back into the answer is with their previous training. So a long run of whatever we're trying to prescribe has to fall in line with the volume that they are doing at the time and the volume that they can build up to in advance of the race. There's no magic prerequisite that is exactly 63 miles that I happen to prescribe for myself. It's just but the philosophy is exactly the same. I did a 63-mile long run exactly because that duration of long run falled in line with what my training could support at the time. So the strategy aligned, but the outcome of what the exact number was is completely different based on the situation. So that's how I kind of like back into the explanation when these like discrepancies, exist. And I could go through any other race that I have done that I'm also coaching an athlete for. I will get that question. What is my longest long run? The athlete will ask me, what is my longest long run going to be? What did you do for your longest long run in advance of that race? And sometimes they're close, but many times they're like 50% different, And in this case, like a 40-mile long run would be completely appropriate for an athlete doing the Badwater 135. And I did a 63-mile long run. And those are two very different. That's 33% different, right? Just doing doing the rough math off the top of my head. So I guess my point is the exact prescription, when you look at it on paper, could be wildly different from one person to the next. And in this case, from me to another athlete. But the strategy of how you get to that can actually be remarkably similar because we're still following the same kind of rules and laws and strategies of periodization and training design and stuff like that. So I think that that's an important, excuse me, as an important component to remember as we're going through all of this. Okay, so Ann, I've teed you up. What's the example that's coming to the forefront of your brain right now in terms of when you have trained for an event, an athlete is training for the same event, and the prescription is different?
I just think this is such a funny question because I think of everyone in such a silo. Like every single one of my athletes is in a complete silo. And yes, the principles of their training are the same, but I could focus. So I might go do a training peaks review for athlete one and then athlete two right after this, and they're training for exactly the same race. And I'm not even thinking about, well, this person's doing this. Why am I having this person do this, which is totally different? Why does this person have 10 hours a week of training? Why does this person have 12? Should I be tweaking what athlete A is doing so it's closer to athlete B? Like the thought doesn't even cross my mind because it's exactly what you said. Like the principles and the foundation of what we're doing exist across all athletes, and that includes myself. But the athletes and their schedules and their histories and their capabilities and what their body can handle, it's just so different that there's no world where I'm going to say, well, I did this and man, I did a really good job. So you should probably do this too. It just, the thought doesn't even occur to me. Now, on the flip side, occasionally there are things that I'll like really mess up. And then I can use that to tell my athletes, all right, I did this really badly for the Florida Keys. I've got someone doing it this upcoming weekend. So I am telling him, like, don't do these things because I really messed this up. I think that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. Or for Tahoe 200 back in the day, just on a whim, my husband and I were like, hey, we should like go out to the Tahoe course and do a marathon a day for 4 days in a row. And it's basically like doing half of the race. And now I work for CTS and I realize this is called a training camp. Like this is a real thing. And this is something I should be prescribing to my athletes. So every once in a while, there are those little moments of genius, like little things that are incredibly effective where, yes, this is totally appropriate to apply to my athlete, or I really screw it up and I use that to influence my athletes' training or their education. But otherwise, like everyone is operating in a complete silo because they're just different human beings and human bodies who just happen to be moving up and down at the same rate or the same distance at the same time.
I've used that silo description a lot with the athletes that I work with. I'm kind of in a little bit of a unique position where I have several like really prolific athletes that everybody wants to follow and emulate on Strava, right? Or emulate their Strava. And a lot of them are training for the same or very similar races. And they will ask me, I'm kind of taking this out of the original context of the discussion, but I think the message point will kind of like translate over. They'll look and say, oh, well, you know, elite athlete XYZ who's training for CCC or whatever, they had this patterning going into this race, and I'm training for CCC. You know, they kind of expect a similar patterning going into it. And I always kind of go back to the theme that we mentioned earlier, is that the strategy generally has like a 90% alignment. I don't know how else to, you know, encapsulate a percentage on that, but I think that that's a pretty good description. The overall strategy, like if we put a long range training plan up for a similar time duration athlete, that's going to match up pretty darn close. But the specifics of it's a 6 hour long run and 2 by 30 minute steady states and things like that, that's where you're going to see kind of like the most amount of variation, or like the density of the training, right? So how much they can handle in a acute period of time, 5 day period of time or something like that, just because the better athletes are going to have more capacity to handle, you know, like higher workloads. But it does put this spotlight, to your point, and it does put a much brighter spotlight on trying to silo the athletes off as much as possible, and then reinforce that this is specific to them, because we have this really neat social application, in mainly Strava, that people use to just, they use it for everything, right? They use it to, you know, satiate their own ego. They use it as a training tool. They use it to see what other people are doing to kind of like glean ideas from. And there are absolutely a lot of bright spots to doing that. You know, I learned things about, you know, certain people's training programs that I wouldn't normally have access to if we didn't have that like transparency on the scene. But there are there are 10 times or 100 times maybe more pitfalls associated with that strategy than anything else.
You know what, one of my I'll call it a theme, but also a lesson for the last several months has been, and this So this started right before Moab 240 last year when I was trying to figure out like what my outcome goal would be, what my process goals would be. And I said number one goal was mind my own business. And I think this applies to training. It applies to racing. Now, if you are trying to be competitive, if you're trying to get a podium spot, like you're probably going to have to pay attention to those around you as well. But generally, for 95% of us, I think just minding your own business is a good way to go about it. Now, with that said, I love Strava. I love giving people kudos. I just think that's super fun. But you just can't get caught up in that. Like I just need to put blinders on to everyone around me, whether I am in a race or focusing on my training, because I need to mind my own business. And the more I do that, I find the less injury prone I am, the better I feel about my training, the better I execute my own plans, and just feel like the outcomes have been stronger just by focusing on that one thing. Like mind your own business.
You're creating your own silo as you being a self-coached athlete, right? So it's the same strategy of siloing out like your individual athletes for what they individually need. You're just applying that same thing to yourself and using this framework, which I think is really cool. I'm going to steal it from you at some point. I'll give you credit for it later. The royalty checks will be in the mail, but using this framework of minding your own business, which I think it will resonate with a lot of people. Ryan, do you want to tack onto that at all?
No, she summed it up perfectly. Just funny anecdote. My rule for myself is I don't follow people who make me feel bad about my own training. So if I've got a really fast friend, I don't follow him because I see that and like, damn, like we used to be the same level and then now we're not, or he's really crushing it and on the roads or vice versa. It's just like I don't if I'm seeing what they're doing and it makes me feel bad, unfollow. Sorry.
You tailor your Strava feed
Yeah.
in order to help your ego, not
Exactly.
intentionally not to hurt it.
Yes,
Fair enough.
exactly.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It's been interesting. Okay, so let's get a little bit more specific. Now we're going to talk about the races, right? And the reason I think that this is really pertinent is unlike the training process, which we can get different levels of transparency. We just mentioned Strava, and people can kind of glean information from that quite readily for a number of different athletes that have trained for races. And I get this all the time. Like athletes come in, I get this inquiry on my website a lot. I was following athlete XYZ that's training for this race. I am now training for that race. Should I follow that exact same patterning? And they're kind of like trying to coach themselves, essentially using the blueprint of other athletes who have trained for those races to get a better fix on the training process. And that happens all the time. But there's an even more specific component of this that doesn't have that lens of transparency, and that's the races themselves. And that's because they're such unique N of one experiences. Like if you go and do the Wasatch 100, or if you go do the San Juan Solstice, that process shows up in one single file on Strava or one single instance of the entirety of the journey, not weeks and months and things like that you can kind of like glean patterns from. So it's a much different proposition of what do you actually translate from your racing experience over to your athletes, because it's that unique property adds this dimension to it that they're going to have a lot of times, like Ryan, you're doing the Hard Rock 100, right? You might only get one shot at this unless you want to wait another decade to get into the race, right? You might get one shot. And so the thirst is to try to accumulate as much of other people's experiences as possible and see if you can somehow apply a filter to those experiences to glean something kind of like relevant for you. So I'm going to kind of ask this of you guys in your professional capacity as coaches. You've got athletes that are training for the same races that you have done. When it comes down to race time, you're going through the race plan and things like that. Can you in any way encapsulate this filter that you have to apply to counseling your athletes who are going into these races that you have done, with this blend of this is what I experienced here versus trying to generalize it to what they may or may not experience? And Ryan, we're going to kind of like start with you. I want to kind of like leave this with, this is kind of like a really tricky, tricky question, because it's based off of a single instance of a race. And even if you have 10 years experience or something like that doing that race, it still is a singular or maybe a few time experience for the athlete. And it just brings a level of complexity to the whole thing.
I think one thing I have to be really mindful of is that technical and runnable is relative. I may define a certain section as, oh, this is really runnable because my strengths are downhill running and I enjoyed that section and I hit it in the daytime without a headlamp. And I have to be mindful to know where that athlete is at. If they are a good downhill runner, if they have confidence in that, are they going to be maybe further behind and be at it with their headlamp? And if we're going through the race plan and I keep saying like, oh yeah, this section is super runnable, and then they get there and it's not runnable to them, like what the hell? What is this counsel I have received? And then like that's not a fun thing to be surprised by at some point in a race. So I think that is one thing of, yes, you experience that in a race, you see it firsthand, you experience it, but again, zoom out and everybody's perspective and their skill level, and when they're going to hit the race, if they're having a crew or not having a crew, that dictates the race plan and how things are going to flow as well. Are they going to have a pacer or not have a pacer? Things of that nature.
And you want to tack onto that?
I would say the things that I can and should be sharing are factual and descriptive. And the things that I should not be sharing with them are emotional or personal. So kind of to Ryan's point, like in this section of the race, I was throwing up off the side of the trail, or I was crying because it was so rough. Like anything that is just based in my feelings, that's not relevant to that person because they might be feeling completely different in that part of the race. But if it is a matter of you are at high altitude, and so this is how you need to adjust your nutrition because that's a fact, that's something we talk about. Or this section of the race has golf ball sized rocks all over the trail for 1 to 2 miles at a 20% grade climb. Like I can share that. That's not me saying, oh, it's so crappy and rocky and annoying and just try to get through it. I'm not trying to attach any emotion to the race description or like what I'm preparing them for, but I can certainly tell them like the facts. This is what you're going to encounter. You might feel this way in this place. And if you do, here's what we're going to do to like mitigate that. But I think the more I can pull my own personal like feelings out of it, the better. But the more I can describe like what they're going to encounter without like planting any ideas in their head about how fun or not fun or like nice it's going to be. I think that's my approach.
I think the
Facts.
factual piece of it is really pertinent. I'm reminded of this the description that Coach AJW sends out every year for the Western States 100. It's a 5 or 6 paragraph, 2,000 word type of deal. And the theme of it, or one of the themes of it, is very factual. He could certainly talk about the many times that he's puked at XYZ point or had an epic bonk, or when so and so passed him, over here, like all those kind of like personal stories. But it's very much, there's a descent. It's 2,000 feet. At the very bottom, you'll find a river. If it's full, if it's full, use the water here. Like all those different, it's almost like geographic inflection points that aren't going to change from year to year unless they change the course or the water conditions are different or things like that. And then also kind of like relative to the climbs and the descents. I take a very similar approaches to you guys. I almost try not to get into the race flow itself, though. And this is where I might deviate from you guys a little bit. Is I really try to. I'll use the word silo off again because we've used it a few times. I really try to silo off the athlete's individual race experience as best I can based on what I know about their training and their experiences, and try to describe the race flow as I would if I hadn't had eyes on the ground, or boots on the ground, so to speak. What the individual or the experiential parts of the race that I actually do emphasize are the things that you aren't going to find in the race manual. So, for example, for Tour de Géant, absolutely have your crew use the Aosta Valley as a base of operations. That doesn't have anything to do with the race itself. You have people coming over and supporting you. Stay in Aosta. It's centrally located. It's an hour drive to anywhere, any of the aid station or any of the life bases that you actually want to get to. It's well resourced. You can come back at any time of night, not really disturb anybody. Like I said, that's just something that is universal, right? Across the entirety of anybody who's actually doing that race, whether it's going to take them 70 hours or the entirety of all 6 days. If they have crew out there, that's something that they can use. The same thing could be said for the Western States 100. The Rayleighs at the corner of Forest Hill Road, and I think it's I-80, is a common rallying point for all of the crews out there to like resupply with food and ice and sandwiches for the day and all those other things. That's not going to change whether they're supporting somebody at the very front of the pack, or the very middle of the pack, or the back of the pack. So when I'm like going over all like the pre-race stuff, I tend to focus on those like external things. A Bighorn would be a really, actually, Ryan, you've got this experience, right? When your crew goes back into Bighorn, there is no cell phone service at all, ever. And that's a thing that's a piece of experience that you get from actually having been out on the course. Once once you leave the town, I'm blanking on the name right now. Ryan, help me out. Sheridan, yeah. Once you leave Sheridan, Wyoming, and go up and over the pass, it's nothing. It's nothing. You're not going to have access to any sort of information at all for the entirety of the race. I think it's those types of things, those types of experiences that I've had out at races personally that I try to translate onto athletes. It's not like the race flow thing itself. So there's a little bit, at least what I do, there's a little bit of this theme that Anne mentioned, where you're trying to keep it factual, but I also try to, I won't say I do this 100% of the time, but I try as much as possible to try to stay out of the actual mile 1 to mile 50 or mile 1 to mile 100, whatever race flow, and keep it to the things as otherwise specified that, you're only going to know unless you actually get you kind of like get on the ground there.
Yeah, the logistics of lodging, the best place to stay.
Exactly.
Okay, it says you can go to this aid station, but you don't want to go there because it's going to be a quick drive for your crew. The road is really rough. Learning those things are key. And in some cases, race manuals are pretty good and giving you those caveats or warnings, but other times they're not. And you learn that the hard way. And we can relay that information so our athletes and their crew do not have to learn it the hard way.
And I think the translatable point for the athletes that are listening is if you're trying to glean race information from other people that have done the race, focus on those factual areas, whether they're within the race itself or the logistics surrounding the race for the crew and support people and things like that. Focus on those areas versus like, was it hot at this section, or is this section runnable, or whatever, because those are all going to be in the kind of in the eye of the beholder. And also they change so much year to year. I mean, even we'll use Bighorn as an example, right? It does have a pretty prototypical muddy section, right?
That can
Every
start
year.
early or late,
Yeah,
depending on the year.
exactly. And it could be like
And the
slightly muddy,
severity of the mud.
slightly muddy, or ridiculously
Yeah.
muddy. And I personally I've raced that race, and I've paced on that race as well, and seen kind of both ends of the muddy spectrum. But trying to ask somebody who has done that race previous years how muddy it actually is, the variability is going to be much more on that individual's interpretation of that, as well as the race day conditions. And that's not something that, even if they're all trying to help out, but it's hard for that individual to actually kind of like translate that to what's actually gonna go on the ground there. So we've got to be really, really kind of like really, really mindful of it.
So in that example, what you take out, fact, it is going to be muddy at some point. Be prepared.
Yeah, exactly.
In training, run in the mud, know what shoe works, what sock, etc. It's going to be muddy. Be prepared.
Yep.
You will find out the severity and when it starts and when it ends on your own. Have fun.
Yep. I mean, pretty much. I mean, you got to reasonably prepare them for that piece because it is so significant. Getting any more granular than it's going to be muddy, I think, is a little bit of it's kind of a little bit of a fool's errand. especially if we're putting ourselves in the position of it's another athlete trying to translate that information to their friend or their training partner, or or some random acquaintance on what the information is going to be on the ground, because that's really the orientation that I have for this particular podcast. Is people are out there, they're trying to glean information from any number of different sources, from the race organization, from friends and family, people who have done the race before, and how to actually kind of apply the filter. I think the right way to apply the filter is more coarse versus fine tune, right? If they're getting really specific and it's 6 inches in this section and 2 inches in this section and really sloppy mud in this other section, just okay, it's muddy. Like that's the translatable point, not the specificity of everything.
You know what else I do? So in conversations with athletes, I try to keep it factual and individual. But then I also have this list of what if scenarios that I give to all athletes before they're doing races like this, especially the longer races. And it's a really long list, and it has things like, what if I get nauseous? What if I lose the ability to eat solid foods? What if this happens? What if I get the worst blisters I've ever had in the world? And what I'll do is, after I have my own race experience and I realize, wow, man, that was a high altitude race and I got this splitting headache up the back of my neck. At this point, maybe that's something I should add to those what if scenarios. And I'm not going to plant the seed for this person and say, this happened to me, so it might happen to you. But I'm going to give them that list of 25 potential scenarios that they could run into in a 100-mile race. And that's going to be one of them. So then they've thought about it. And then they've come up with what their plan of action would be if that happened. So if it does happen, okay, they've got a plan. And if it doesn't happen, I haven't planted the seed that, well, this happened to me, so it's probably going to happen to you. But it's kind of a sneaky way to at least get them thinking about all of these potential things that could occur during the course of their race.
It ends up being like, you can't predict the unpredictable, right? But you've got to have a reasonable toolkit for when those things do, when shit actually does kind of like hit the fan,
Yeah.
Ryan, how do you help your athletes kind of like navigate that unpredictable piece of it? And by the way, this unpredictable piece, that is the root of the most common question that I get. How long should my longest long run be? Because inevitably there's a big gap between that longest long run and the actual race. And I think that that trying to satiate that gap leads to that very question. And it's the same theme as you just mentioned, like what happens, what if I encounter these things that I haven't encountered before, gotten nauseous, gotten blisters, things like that, but B, are very difficult to predict if they're actually going to happen. So they're all kind of like wrapped up in the same theme. And I think the navigation tools that you can use both in advance and actually during when those things happen are kind of remarkably similar. So Ryan, I'll ping it over to you. Like, how do you help your athletes kind of be armored up for those types of things?
Go through the what if scenarios, like Ann says, and try to find moments in their training that it has happened. And then did you handle it successfully? Great. We're going to repeat that process you did to handle it, solve the problem, or you did not. So now let's learn from it. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do differently the next time? Or the feet situation, the stomach situation. Well, if it does happen, let's have this first aid kit, so to speak, this backup plan of the shoes and socks in the drop bag, some Tums, or this food that always sets really well with you. Go through the what if scenarios. If you have solved them in training, fantastic. Repeat that success. If not, let's keep discussing it and figure out what your mental flow chart is going to be to go and try to solve that issue.
Yeah, so I keep it really simple. So the two most common things are foot problems and stomach problems. There's a whole list of other things. You can have vision problems, you can get off course, things like that. But I kind of start with those because you can kind of come up with some really easy concrete things to do. So I teach people how to tape their feet, use some kinesiology tape and some tincture of benzoin to kind of like stick it on. And I'll do a little Zoom call to show them how to like pre-cut the patches and stuff like that. And, some of that is functional, but a lot of it is psychological. It's like, now I have something that I know I can do that I've at least practiced one or two times before, that if I have to do it in a race, granted, it's a different spot on my foot, it's different, whatever. I've at least got some kind of resource there. So that's what I do on the foot thing. And on the stomach thing, although there's once again a myriad of wives' tales out there on how to fix a sour stomach, right? You want to stand on your head and ginger beer and suck on a candy and all these other kind of things. Slow down and cool off. Just start there. We know that actually works, right? You reduce your intensity and you can reduce your core temperature and you can redistribute some of the blood flow to your gastrointestinal system. Start with that, and then any of the other stuff that you hear at the aid stations or somebody that's running next to you, tells you to try, then you can deploy those kind of things. But just start with slowing down and cooling off. And then the final thing I kind of like armor up my athletes is more of an attitude. And I take this from, it's not my conjuring. It's somebody that I've worked with for years. It's this former Navy SEAL that I've done a number of projects with that some people in the audience will recognize who it is. Harold Zendel, otherwise known as German. And he's been around the scene for a long time. And whenever we've been out on projects and stuff goes south, which is inevitably the case with these events, he would always just look at me and goes, "There's always a solution, Koop. Let's just find it. There's always a solution." And so I think that attitude, like armoring athletes up with that attitude of there's always a solution, you just have to find it, is really empowering. It doesn't matter how bad your feet get or how bad your brain gets or how bad your stomach gets or whatever kind of like ails you. There's always a solution out there. You just got to find it, and you can actively work towards whatever that solution is, even if it's just guessing. There's kind of like nothing wrong with that in many cases, because there are any different number of kind of permutations of how these things arise, and you can't be completely prepared for all of them. But you can be completely prepared to actively try to find a solution, because it is actually out there. So there's always a solution. So I kind of start with those three things, two things that are super tangible: feet, stomach, easy solutions. And the last one is it kind of covers everything else all at the same time, right? I don't try to get too granular of what if this, what if this, what if that, because you can play that game like an infinite number of times, right? I try to have one thing that encompasses it all, and that is always try to find a solution. There's always a solution out there.
Well, maybe the conversation is because we all have that like pre-race check-in where we're talking about the outcome goals, the process goals, the fine tuning, like the last things we need to talk about. Maybe part of that conversation also needs to be like, all right, here's the plan. We just talked about all of this. Let's assume something's going to go wrong. Like, how are you going to deal with that mentally? What is going to be the mantra or the trigger that you're using to like keep you mentally strong when something goes wrong? And then the second question is, if something goes wrong or when it goes wrong, are you willing to use every minute that the race is giving you to try to fix this and try to stay in the race? And for some people, the answer is no, because there's a time goal. But for those, especially more towards the mid and the back of the pack, I really try to encourage them, like, you paid for this many minutes of running, so you better use every single minute that you are given. Like, use the resources, use the time, and just see what you can fix. And I would rather you run out of time trying to fix problems versus giving up on them before even trying to solve them.
Yeah, there's a lot of what I would call like mid-pack people that have a lot of time to spare to finish a race. And some of them within their own like goal setting framework, it's absolutely important to them to finish, like no matter what. So they were aiming for a 24-hour buckle at the Western States 100. They're not going to get that. And it's absolutely important for them to finish under the 30-hour cutoff. Some athletes, it's not a part of their goal orientation. They kind of want to go time XYZ or bust, right? 25 hours or bust. And if I run into a spot where I have to fix all these problems, they're just not interested in, staying out there for 30 hours when they were expecting a 20-hour day or kind of something like that. And I do think that some of that is in the eye of the beholder, and we're not going to adjudicate, the merits of DNFing versus not DNFing or kind of like sticking it out during this. But I do think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, either with your coach, your support system, or even just internally, for if you are faced with that, what are you going to do? Because the last thing you want to have happen is make the wrong decision under duress, which can happen very, 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 very frequently because you don't have time to process what this framework is that you should have processed beforehand when you're not under that same amount of duress. It's not easy, but it's a lot easier to come up with that framework when you're sitting down in your office or you're just on a normal run. Hey, what if this actually happens? Do I want to finish? Do I want to suck it up or not? That's a way easier thing to work through in advance than when you're sitting at the aid station, puking your guts out, and you haven't slept for 35 hours, and you're trying to discern what is valuable to you and what is within your value set and relevant relative to, do I need to actually finish this race or not? That's a hard thing to actually come up with in real time for a lot of individuals. So I think the learning lesson with that is figure it out in advance. You're much more well resourced to do that in advance versus when you're trying to do it in real time. Okay, I'm going to open it up for last thoughts. Ryne, you get to go first. Any last thoughts for the athletes out there that are entering the racing season? They're trying to glean as much information as possible from all of the different sources of information that they can get it from. Strava, friends, coaches, people who, just the peanut gallery out there that tells them they should be that they should be doing things. Is there anything you want to impart on the listeners on how to navigate this wild landscape as they're getting ready for races?
Listen to it all, but be selective in what you maybe attach to. Maybe attach is not the right word, but listen, take it in. Take your buddy's funny anecdote about the mud at Bighorn. It started at mile 30 for him that year, or any sort of thing. Take it in, but never get attached to one specific thing that's like, oh, that's probably going to happen to me, so I should be prepared. Or they made up a bunch of time on this part of the course, or whatever it may be.
Perfect. And you want to opine on that as well?
Yeah, I'd say two things. So similar train of thought to Ryne. Allow yourself to be inspired by other people, but don't allow yourself to be pressured by what other people are doing or what other people are saying. And then also, I feel like this is a sport that is equally problem solving and physical. So, maybe you're not the best athlete in the world, but if you're a really good problem solver, that's going to make up for a lot when it comes to race day. So know that. And if that is a weakness of yours, if you're an extremely talented athlete, but not necessarily a strong problem solver, that's probably something that you'll also want to be working on. So I think be inspired by people, don't be pressured by people. And then remember that problem solving is a big part of the game. So make sure that's part of your skill set as well.
I like that. I like that a lot. I'll play ball here on this one as well. I think that one of the hardest skills to develop as a coach is taking a big set of information and making it individual and specific for one person. That's ultimately why we are all in business. We have this big set of information that we have from physiology and experience and practice and things like that. And we're trying to distill all of that information that's in textbooks and classes and courses and experiences that we have in continuing education courses and things like that. And we're trying to distill it down to a individual for a situation, right? That's the skill set. That is hard. That's hard. That's what we work on developing as professionals. So realizing that that's a hard skill set, and pinging off a little bit of Ryan's theme, listen to it all. People are very well intended by wanting to give advice and counsel and things like that, but realize that distillation down to you as an individual is very difficult to do, even if you are trained, right? Even for me as a trained professional, that's the hardest thing that I have to do every single day of every single week is this distillation process. So don't feel bad if you can't make the translation. So do listen to it all. Try to scrutinize it as much as possible for what's going to be specific to you. And at the end of the day, default to the themes that are more general versus specific. And I think you've got a good pathway to take almost anything and have it be relatable and functional to you if you kind of take that sequential process of things. This was fun.
Said.
Yeah, this was fun, you guys. Thanks for coming on. And can we Can we invite you back and put you on the spot since this is your first time? We didn't scare you off.
I would love to. I'm hoping that next time I'll be at greater than like 60% brain capacity because I think I'm still not quite there from Cocodona, but I'd love to come back. This is fun.
What
Yeah,
day
share
did
with the
you?
listeners. Yeah, how many days out are you?
Oh,
Jeez,
you're gonna make me
if
do
you
can't
know.
even
math?
do that. I can't even do that
Okay.
math.
Early morning Friday, 2 a.m. Friday is when I finish. So Saturday, Sunday, Monday, what day is it?
It's
So
currently
it's Tuesday, right?
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
4 days out. That was 4 days ago.
Yeah, so these big long races, they skew your sense of time and calendar, right? Because they occupy so much of it, and then it's offset from like a normal work week. So then you're like, what day is it and everything? But I'm really impressed with your intellectual faculty right now in Tisdale. Like having been, once again, I'm going to translate my personal experience onto you in the exact opposite manner that, we've all talked about. I know after Tour de Jean and after Cocodona myself, I'm a intellectual pile of mush for at least a week, probably 2 weeks. So you got something going on.
Well, I'll tell you, I went to bed. So finished the race at 2, went to bed at 4, woke up at 6:30 and was like, all right, I guess seize the day. Here we go. And checked my emails. I don't know what I said in response to those emails, but I like cleared out my inbox and I should probably go back and check
I was
to
about
see
to
what I
say,
said to those people.
your athletes listening to this now have context to whatever counsel you were giving them at the
Whatever I
time
said.
and whatever. Yeah, exactly. Treat it with a little bit of suspect.
It's like 200-mile drunk text or something.
I think that we should after these things we should put it like the legal disclaimers that you see at the end of a lot of your athletes' emails. We should customize that based on if we're coming from an event or something like this. Like take this advice with a grain of salt. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
Blah.
Yep.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming on the podcast. We're going to bring both of you guys back. It's racing season. I'm sure there's lots of other anecdotes and stories and things that we can impart on listeners from both our experiences, but also the experiences that we have our athletes. So once again, appreciate you guys. All right, folks. There you have it. There you go. Much thanks to coaches Ann and Ryne for coming on the podcast today. And I just can't tell you guys how impressed I am with Ann and not only her finish for Cocodona, but coming onto the podcast today and being as articulate as she is. She doesn't really kind of skip a beat, and you would have never have known that she went through all the sleep deprivation and pain and agony and suffering and all those things that you go through when you do a 250-mile race that she did just a mere few days ago before recording this podcast. So shout out to Ann for coming on the podcast today and opining on this extremely important aspect that I think a lot of athletes are facing in front of them right now as we are entering the racing season. All right, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and your training partners. As always, this podcast is brought to you without sponsors or endorsements or advertisement of any kind. And if you want to help support this podcast, just share it with people and tell them how much you like the information. That is all you have to do. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners out there. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.